A lot of people say you should never judge a book by its cover, but if you are a writer or you're a publisher, that's definitely the wrong thing to do, because people do judge a book by its cover. And I've got data to show that people do that. People do make first impressions based on what your book looks like. And so in this episode, we're talking to expert Rebekah Haskell, who's one of my favorite book cover designers. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the elements of a good book cover, how it works for different tropes and for different types of books. And we've also got her secret weapon, which is pre-made book designs that you can then take away, edit for your book and release. So you can get really professional book covers without having to go through the whole design process. So it's really interesting to hear how that whole design process works and how you can take a few little shortcuts to make it a little bit cheaper, but also still get a really great result in the end. Rebekah is a really, really interesting person. So she's really funny. So I think you're going to do a lot of laughing during the episode as well. So I hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you soon. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Publishing Performance Show. I'm delighted to be joined today by Rebekah Haskell, who is the owner and the lead designer of vividcovers.com. So thank you for joining me, Rebekah.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Teddy. I appreciate it.
Great. So you guys are experts in creating covers for all sorts of genres, but mostly you specialize in fiction. So we're going to talk mostly about fiction today. So why don't we go a bit back to the basics of creating covers? So what does the process of getting a cover designed for a self-published book look like?
So generally speaking, the process is generally very much the same every single time. Although the amount of, I think, education or back and forth that needs to happen with authors is going to depend on how experienced they are in the field. I've had authors come to me who are like, I have no idea what I'm doing. What do I expect? And we can chat a little bit about it. But generally speaking, an author will contact me. They will let me know about the project that they're working on, that they're looking for a cover, and roughly what they're looking for. And we will just have a little chat. Usually it's via email. Sometimes I will have a client that wants to Zoom together or have a phone call, because that's just a way that they feel more comfortable communicating their ideas. And it can be, while it's a little trickier, obviously, to schedule that than to schedule an email, that's totally fine as well. The important part is that the author feels comfortable. They're able to communicate what their ideas are and exactly what they're looking for. And we just talk a little bit about the project. I like to get visual examples from an author of kind of what they're looking for. I think that that's really helpful in bridging the gap between word people and picture people. And a lot of times authors will be very much word people, and artists like myself will very much be picture people. And so getting visual examples from an author of kind of what they're looking for. I know every author, I think this is just, it's every author. We start thinking of what the cover is going to look like the moment we start writing the book, And so kind of getting some of those ideas of what they have in mind, what speaks to them, the things that attract them. And then we can kind of take those preferences and try to fit it into what is more of a marketing-based approach to the cover, because I find that to be just overall significantly more effective if you can approach the cover from the standpoint, not necessarily of this is a visual representation of your story, and more that this is a reflection of who your audience is. I think the one thing that at this point, when we're having this discussion and kind of talking about what the expectations are for the project, the one thing that is the most difficult to get past if an author really hasn't conceptualized who their audience is, who they're writing the book for, because ultimately the author is the only person that can answer that question. My clients know their books better than I ever will. And I actually do get the question, I get the question, are you going to read my book? And the answer is almost always no. That doesn't mean I've never read a client's book. I have read clients' books before, but that was for fun because I was intrigued by the project. But as far as research for doing the work, I do find it counterproductive to read the actual text. I vastly dislike it when I receive excerpts of the book from the author as guidance for various things. For instance, if I'm asking, how do you want me to illustrate a character? And they send me an excerpt of how that character is introduced in the book. Listen, I just want, here's the reason why, is because prose tends to not be super prescriptive. It doesn't tend to be really dry. I mean, that's what we're trying to avoid, right? We don't have a dossier. You're trying to evoke something with the prose. I don't want to be evoked. I want a dossier. I want to know what the height, weight, build, skin color, hair color, what style of clothing they're wearing. I just want a list, just the facts,
Yeah.
So I really appreciate it when authors will have just those bare bones things for me. And trying to interpret an entire text, I think it gets in the, well, first of all, the ROI on reading a book before starting the project. If I have to sink 6 to 10 hours into reading a novel that may or may not be to my taste prior to beginning on the cover, obviously that's going to massively lengthen the project. It's going to make it more expensive is what it's going to do. But also, I don't think it's helpful because that distance is almost necessary, I think. You really do want to have kind of an eagle's eye view of the story and the project itself in order to really be successful in generalizing the project. I think that act of generalizing is difficult for authors because they're so close to their project. Everything feels really, really important. I think it's the same struggle that they have when trying to formulate a blurb,
Yeah.
the back cover copy or the marketing text that you're going to put up on Amazon, trying to decide what to include and what to omit. So I don't find it useful to read the actual text prior to going into the project. I really do love having a nice, concise, and clear overview, if that's something that the author can provide.
Yeah.
There are definitely cases where they don't feel comfortable providing that, and we can kind of go back and forth on it and kind of try to distill the project down to what its essence is so that we can figure out what's going to, I don't want to say represent the story the best on the cover, but represent who is supposed to be buying this story, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, that's quite an important thing to talk about, isn't it? The difference between who's going to buy it and who you're just representing on the cover. Because, say for example, an obvious one like Harry Potter. I mean, you've got a picture of Harry Potter on the front. If you had him in sort of dark, like with like loads of girls around him or something like that, it would be completely wrong to the idea of the book being for children, where you've got that kind of cartoony picture on the front. So yeah, that is really important. Who's actually going to be buying it? Now, when a customer comes to you, or sort of a client comes to you, and they've got an idea for a book, what level of information would you need in order to start making a cover?
I think the most basic information that I need is I need to know what genre it
Okay.
is. I need to know the basic genre and roughly what the plot is. Just broadly,
Yep.
what the premise of the story is. So to be perfectly honest, I have plenty of clients that come to me with just that back cover text, that little blurb of marketing text. That will give me everything that I need for a cover. I might need to give a few more details about specific things so that I can make sure that I'm accurate visually when I'm creating settings or illustrating characters and that sort of thing. But essentially it is the genre, simply because there are genre conventions in stories, there are also genre conventions on the cover. And generally speaking, and I know that a lot of writers struggle with this because writers in general tend to be unusual. They tend to be unusual readers. Writers, by and large, tend to be omnivorous readers, and they are a little peculiar in their reading habits and in their purchasing habits. And one of the things that I think is really useful from a marketing standpoint as an author is to try to distance yourself a little bit from your personal preferences and what you are assuming your audience's preferences are. By and large, the data shows that readers already know what kind of book they're looking for when they go on Amazon and start looking through the bestseller lists or whatever. They already know what they're looking for, and they already know they have already been trained basically by the genre that they prefer. Most people read in just one genre, maybe in a second one, as well, but most readers have primarily one genre that they spend the majority of their time in. And they have certain expectations for what they're looking for on the cover that are going to cue them into, this is the book for me, this is not the book for me, etc., etc. Readers, by and large, are looking for a similar emotional experience to one that they have already had. They're looking for the same but different, very much. And so there are certain visual cues that they are searching for on the covers of the books to cue them into, this is similar to something I have already read and loved. And so this might be the book for me. And if we aren't cued into what those symbols are and what your audience in particular is responding to and recognizing as, this is the book for me, you're going to miss your audience completely. I tell the story of this gentleman that I've had. And obviously symbols have a lot of power. We're very symbol driven as a species. It's a really powerful way to communicate. I had a client years ago who was writing a very gritty, grown-up science fiction novel. And he was adamant that he needed a butterfly on the cover. And it needed to be a very prominent symbol on the cover. And because in his story, the symbol of the butterfly kind of symbolized his character's inner journey, her metamorphosis from the beginning to, her emotional journey throughout the book. And what I tried to communicate to him at that time was that the symbol of the butterfly, in particular, the butterfly that he had in mind, which was a lot of pastel colors, was going to send some really mixed messages on the cover of the book about who the audience was, what the tone was. To have that symbol be so dominant on the cover of a very dark, gritty, grown-up sci-fi novel, there were going to be a lot of people who would really enjoy a gritty, dark, grown-up sci-fi novel who were going to see that prominent symbol on the cover and think, oh, that's not for me. That's not meant for me. And they are going to move past it. Meanwhile, people who were in a place that they would respond well to that symbol were going to get into the book and think, what the hell is this? Which obviously is not, the reaction that you're looking for. Symbols have a lot of power and they have different meanings to different people depending on what they're looking for in a book. And if you can key into that, into what your specific readers respond really well to on the cover of a novel, your ability to get your book into the hands of the right readers is going to be increased exponentially.
Yeah. So you're talking about like genre specific tropes. Is that a good way of describing it?
Yeah, no, that's a good way to describe it. Visual tropes. Yeah.
There's some really obvious ones which are probably quite stereotypical, like a romance book has flowers and it's white or pink, or those sort of like quite stereotypical things, whereas a sci-fi might be quite dark with spaceships and things like that. Are there any like key tropes that aren't just about how it looks? Some of it's more about the colors and the style of the pictures on the front cover.
Almost every single genre is going to have tropes down to the color palette.
Yeah.
Now, these things do change over time. So that is something to be aware of. I do think a lot of people come into the publishing space thinking, I'm going to get one cover and that's going to be my cover for the next 20 years. If you publish a book and you're selling it in 20 years, I guarantee you, unless you have just given up on it, given up on trying to sell it, it's probably going to have a different cover. Just because these expectations and the tropes that your audience is responding to do change, not super fast. You're not going to have to buy a new cover every year, but it's not uncommon, even in the traditional publishing field, for a book over its lifetime to have a number of different covers as it's kind of honing in and refining its marketing approach towards its audience. So some of the things that there are some genres where the visual tropes that the audience of that genre responds to are more specific than others. For instance, thrillers tend to have a very, very specific look to the covers. There's really not a whole lot of variation. One of the ways to kind of keep tabs on what's going on in a genre and where those visual tropes are and what that audience is responding to right now is to keep an eye on the bestseller lists on Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
If you will go to the bestseller list for a specific category and subcategory on Amazon, you have to do a little work when you do this. You have to do a little prep work. What I like to do is I take screenshots of like the top 50. Then you need to go in and you need to remove anything that's miscategorized.
Yeah,
and
that happens a lot on Amazon.
On Amazon, you know that's a fair number of things. Anything that doesn't quite fit in that category that somebody has used as a secondary category, or maybe just a way to get that bestseller tag in a smaller, you know what I'm saying?
It's basically Atomic Habits on the top of all of the, on top of every single leaderboard. Atomic Habits is there for some reason. You'll be in sci-fi and Atomic Habits is number one.
I remember my husband when he first started publishing in, what was it? The majority of his work, his earlier work, is in the superhero category. And he would get so frustrated finding all of this paranormal romance in the superhero category. And he would get into back and forths with paranormal romance authors online. You're like, what are you doing? And they're like, well, they have powers, so technically they are a but I guarantee you, anybody looking for superhero fiction is not looking for paranormal romance. No. It's not what they're looking.
No, but you're saying you look at the top sellers and you remove the ones that are not relevant.
Yes, exactly. Anything that's miscategorized, and also you need to remove anything that is traditionally published. The traditional publishing industry, side of the industry, has access to a marketing infrastructure that is completely wildly different than what independent authors or even small publishers who use the independent publishing avenue, basically. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about, for instance, Athon Books, big publisher right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, they are one of the top sellers in the genres that they sell on Amazon. So not terribly small, but they are using those independent publishing avenues. So I'm talking about like more the big six and more the traditional, well, the big five now, but the traditional model of doing things. There is a completely different path to the market for them than there is for anybody who is using the independent publishing model. And because of that, their approach to covers is very different. And it's not something that is going to be useful for an independently published author to model their process after. So you want to remove all of those covers from the bestseller list as well.
That's interesting that you say that about the traditionally published books, because I'll be honest, you're the first person I've heard say that, which I think is an interesting way that you're approaching it, because a lot of people say, oh, go to bookshops, see what's on the shelves and see what's selling well. But what you're saying is if you are self-published, you've really got to think a bit more like a self-published author and be a bit more independent in your thought. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Here's the thing is, the traditional published model, the publishers they've never been selling to readers. They've always been selling to booksellers. It's a different customer that they are courting when they are choosing their marketing, like what kind of words they put on the back, what kind of images they put on the front, the size of the books, the colors that they use. It's all very geared to those physical books and how they present in a physical space. Wow. Whereas when you are selling directly to a reader, you will notice that traditionally published book covers generally tend to be a lot more muted in color palette. They don't have as much bright colors. They don't have as much contrast. They don't necessarily have as much excitement and action on the covers. A lot of times they will have much more, I want to say, and as a designer, this can be sometimes a little frustrating because the traditionally published books have freedom to explore certain design styles that just don't translate as well with the direct author to reader track that's happening for the independent published authors, especially because the majority of books being sold by independent authors are ebooks. That's the majority of them across all genres.
Yeah.
Now,
For fiction,
there
you mean?
are for fiction, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Obviously, nonfiction is a completely different game.
Yeah.
For fiction, the majority of those books that are being sold are
Ebooks.
I'm so sorry.
Ebooks on Kindle.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
are electronic. And because of that, the way it has changed the way that readers shop for it, basically it's going to be on a device about this big, sometimes on their Kindle, but those Kindles are so slow at the best of times.
And often black and white as well.
Right, exactly. And the majority of them are still black and white. So a lot of people will look for them on their phone. So you've got a device maybe that yay big, okay? Let's say your thumbnail is about that big, maybe. That changes the way that we have to create a lot more contrast than you're going to have on a traditionally published cover. The thumbnail is so important. If I look at a thumbnail for a book and I can't tell roughly what's happening, that's a problem, because for a lot of readers, that's the only glimpse of your cover they're ever going to have, is that tiny little thumbnail. And if you can't get past that, you can't sell them. You don't have any other room to persuade them to buy your book. They never even get to that introductory text. So there's a lot of difference in the way a traditionally published book will be marketed and the way a independently published fiction book will be marketed. So once you have removed all of the traditionally published covers and the miscategorized covers from a specific genre, what you want to do is you want to look at what's left. Mm-hmm. And these are all bestsellers. This is a pre-selected list. And the fun thing about the Amazon bestseller list is it's been pre-selected by sales. So the readers have made the decision of what's on this list. And you can see in real time what they're responding to. You'll go to thrillers and you'll notice psychological thrillers tend to be a rundown house or a lonely looking, natural vista in kind of desaturated monochromatic colors. And it's going to have really big, bold lettering with usually a very catchy title. The titles are super important for thrillers. If you're looking more at, let's say, a spy thriller or a crime thriller, you're going to have, generally speaking, a suited gentleman running into a vague background. It's also going to be very monochromatic, reds, blacks, grays, very popular in that genre. The thriller, I do find that the thriller genre tends to be the most prescriptive. Not the most, but one of the most prescriptive genres, as this is what the readers expect. Just give them this over and over again. Just give them a really good example of what they're expecting, and it'll do its job. You know what I'm saying? I think another one that also has some pretty standardized rules are the romance genres. Now, each romance subcategory has its own little set of rules. So if you're publishing in those categories, it's great to do that research as well. But one of the examples of change that I've seen is in the urban fantasy genre. I have watched it changed from, for years, it was some really badass looking heroine in a leather jacket with some magic in one hand, maybe, or a weapon.
A bit like Hunger Games or something like that.
Against some urban background. It's going to be dark blues, maybe some orange, a lot of black, very deep colors. Usually a moon in the background somewhere, especially if it has some werewolf vibes. There has been a big shift from that to very text-based covers, where it's going to be a background with leaves or vines or thorns or something, and then a very prominent title. So more of like inanimate, less character-based, more text-based, maybe the symbol of the series or something like that. So I've seen a big shift in that genre in particular. So genres do change. I'm still waiting for the thriller genre to change. It might take some while. Thrillers also have been very traditionally published dominant for a very long time as well. And I do think that kind of slows down this cycle. When it's more publisher to bookseller to reader, I feel like the shift is much slower than when it's from author to reader. The shorter that line is between the who is producing the fiction and who is consuming the fiction is, I think the quicker the market tends to turn. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I mean, this is absolutely fascinating. I thought we were going to talk about covers generally, but this has become a bit of a philosophical and instruction into what covers work well for best genres. I think it's absolutely fascinating. You clearly know exactly what you're talking about. One of the
I do
things,
my best.
yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the things I noticed, so on your website, and we'll come to this in a sec with the pre-made covers, but you've got hundreds of examples of covers that you've created on your website. And talking about the tropes and the things that you have on your website, and also talking back to our first question where we ask if someone came to you with a book idea, what they should have, and you were talking about the characters. Now, some books have the characters on the front, some might have something else on the front, such as a scene. Is there a way that you would help an author to decide whether they should be having like a scene or they should be having the main character or a different character on the cover?
Mm-hmm. What I would do primarily is look at what's happening in the genre.
Yeah.
Are those primarily character based? That also the way that you handle the character can be different depending on subgenres. I do a lot of work in science fiction and fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
In science fiction, for quite a while, we didn't have any characters on the front of those covers. It was all spaceships. It was spaceships all day long, every day. I do feel like that is shifting a little bit away from just. I feel like the readers got a little bored. Like, show us a little bit more of your world than just whatever spaceship, spoke to you at the moment. But so we're seeing more characters on more humanoid characters. A lot of times it's still going to be like a person in space armor or something like that on the covers of those science fiction novels. In fantasy, generally speaking, you can either have those symbol based inanimate covers that I was talking about in urban fantasy, or you can have I do think I see a difference between sword and sorcery, which does tend to be sword and sorcery as a subgenre of fantasy tends to be more tighter POV, smaller stakes. It's all about the life and death of the specific primary characters of the story. Whereas epic fantasy, for instance, is much more zoomed out. It's much more big world altering stakes, generally speaking, more points of view. I kind of feel like George R. R. Martin sort of married those two subgenres pretty well, because he had that very tight in, are they going to live, are they going to die? But then he had the big picture as well. With sword and sorcery, I do feel like that's reflected in how prominent the character is, whereas in epic fantasy, you still see a lot of big sweeping vistas and huge fortresses in the distance, and maybe a dragon in the sky. And then you'll have the character, this little character, kind of overlooking this enormous vista, and it kind of communicates what the scope of the book is. So when we're kind of making that decision about, do we put the character on the front of the book? Which character are we going to go for? Generally speaking, when you're choosing the character, I think it's most common to put the main character on the book, but you can also put the villain on the book. It really depends on who's the most visually interesting. I do think sometimes you have to look at it from the point of view, not necessarily of what is the most accurate to the story, and pivot towards what's the most visually interesting part of the story, if that makes sense. But we will definitely look at what are people in this genre purchasing this genre, what are they responding to the most right now when we're making that decision.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's really good advice. Now, I know you've got two services on your website. So you obviously, what we've been talking about now is completely customized services where people come to you with their finished book and they say, this is the kind of thing I'm looking for. These are the characters. And then together you work together to make a book cover. But also, which I think is quite unique and great for people who are maybe on a bit more of a budget, you've got pre-made covers which cover all the different genres, like the sci-fi and fantasy and the sci-fi fantasy and those genres that you mostly cover. And you've got hundreds on your website for people to choose from. So what made you get started in making those?
Let me interject something real quick before I answer that question. If If you have any viewers who are considering custom work, it is probably best to start that process while you're in the middle of the book rather
Right.
than waiting until the book is completely done, unless you were a discovery writer and you don't know what shape the book is going to have until it's finished. And I understand that's fairly common, especially for newer authors. So if you want to wait until the book is completely set in stone before you move toward the cover phase, that's fine. But keep in mind that custom work takes weeks. It takes weeks. There's a lot of time there. So if you're going to finish your book completely and then engage in the cover process, most artists, you're going to have to wait. That generally speaking, I book about 2 or 3 months in advance. So
Wow.
anybody
Okay.
who's booking my services right now for custom work, we're going to be starting in January most likely,
Right.
and then it's going to take a certain number of weeks to complete the project. So just keep in mind that there's a lag time there between when you contact the artist that you want to work with and when you're actually going to have a cover that's ready for upload. I have a lot of clients that they will come to me as soon as they have the idea for the book. I have clients who feel like the cover is really helpful for them in helping inspire the story. There are some people who prefer to be completely done with it before they begin the process. Most of my clients, it's somewhere in the middle. They'll be maybe halfway through the book when they initiate that cover process, so that by the time that they're done, it's gone through editing, they're working on the formatting, they'll actually have a cover in their possession. For pre-mades, which you asked about, the reason I actually started offering pre-mades before I started offering custom work. I started doing covers back in 2013, 2014, and it was because I was part of the writer community. I write. I have not published anything because I've gotten a little sidetracked.
Leave your
I
husband
got
to
a
do
little
it.
sidetracked with what really honestly has become my dream job, which is covers.
Yeah.
But I had a lot of friends in the author community as the independent publishing movement sort of began and started to grow. They had books that they wanted to publish and they needed covers. And I had a graphic design background. Now, I had a lot of learning to do there at that beginning because I thought, oh, hey, I'll just put something that looks nice, it'll be fine. And to be perfectly honest, the very beginning of the independent publishing movement in the industry was the perfect time to not know a whole lot about it because we were all figuring it out. But yeah, I started creating first covers for those friends, and then there were a few other people who were providing sort of covers on spec. So we would design the cover and say, "Hey, do you have a romance novel that might fit this, or do you have a thriller novel?" And we would basically try to shoot straight down the line of those genre tropes as they existed at the time. And it's sort of like purchasing clothing off the rack rather than having it tailored to you. Maybe the sleeves are a little bit too long, maybe just a little bit, or maybe, it's a little bit big in the center here. And obviously, you can always go to the artist and see if you can have it tailored. It's probably just for those pre-mades, it's usually an additional cost to have it customized because the whole point of that pre-made is it's much there's much smaller time investment required for me to create a cover on spec than to me to do it to somebody else's specifications.
I was going to ask about that. So with the pre-made covers, so I'm looking at one now, and which I like the most from your pre-mades, which is called the King's Ranger, and it's got a guy that looks a bit like Legolas with a bow and arrow. And it looks really cool.
I like that one too.
Yeah, but say my book wasn't called the King's Ranger; it was called something else. Would I be able to change the
Oh,
name, or
the titles are completely just contextual. The
so
titles,
just
that
a
is,
picture?
I have sold a few pre-mades where they're like, I like that title, let's keep it. But the vast majority of them, we will change the
Right.
the typography to match their title.
Cool.
So
Yeah.
yeah, just like it won't say Vivid Covers on the front either. It'll have your author name.
Yeah. Yeah.
Once it's published. So
Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to just check that one. But they're really good. I mean, you could definitely take a lot of these and just run straight with them. If people wanted to customize them a little bit, is that possible?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Generally speaking, it depends on what the customization that they're looking for is. There are certain, and it's hard to know if you're not an artist, what customizations are. It's so funny. It always cracks me up a little bit when I have a client come to me and say, "Hey, can you make this change?" it shouldn't take you much time. And I'm like, wow.
How do you know?
How do
You
you
do
know? I do
it.
remember once I had a client's tiny change. Well, sometimes it'll seem like a big thing. He's like, I don't know if this is possible. I'm like, this will take me 15 minutes. Don't worry. But there was another instance. He's like, I've got this tiny change. I just make it this little tiny spot. And it was just a little tiny part of the image. But there were like 74 layers in the
Photoshop.
digital,
Yeah.
yeah, in the image. And I had to go through and make the change on every single layer. It took me like the better part of an hour just to change that little tiny thing there in the corner. So the best thing that you can do is just ask.
Yeah.
There are plenty of changes that I'll make if someone purchases a Premade and says the ship is blue. I'd really like it if the ship was red. Easily done. That is not a problem at all in most cases, and that won't incur any additional charge. I did have a gentleman who purchased a series of covers, and he wanted some more significant changes. He wanted the weapon that the character was using to be changed out. He wanted some things about the background changed, and I just issued him an estimate for the work. So just based on my hourly rate, I estimated how long it would take me, and that's what he paid for the changes.
Great. I mean, I think it's a great service. So if you are writing books in sci-fi fantasy and also fantasy, I definitely recommend checking it out. Those are the three genres that you mostly work in.
Mostly anything that falls underneath the speculative fiction umbrella. So anything in the realm of science fiction, fantasy, urban fantasy. I do some thrillers and some historical fantasy as well. Generally speaking, because I'm an illustrator, I mostly stick to the genres where illustration is more common. Now, obviously, thrillers is not one of those, but I pull out my photo manipulation skills for that one. So
Yeah, cool. I mean, this has been a
in
really good
general,
conversation.
yeah,
Sorry.
absolutely. In general, if someone is looking, I do get this question all the time. I get the, can you do this? At this point in my career, I've done almost everything at this point, and I've kind of specialized in the things that I just enjoy the most. But in general, I do recommend, if you are looking for a new artist to do your cover, make sure that they have an example of what it is you want actually in their portfolio. You want to have visual representation of the type of cover that you're looking for in their portfolio before you hire someone. It's the safest way to do that.
Great. I mean, that's really good advice. I've loved this conversation. I want to speak to you again about covers. I'm really looking forward to meeting you in person so we can chat about covers some more.
Yeah, that'll be great. So it's one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, I can tell.
I told you before. You need someone to talk about this for 6 hours. I am your.
The covers queen. You should trademark it. Well, thank you so much. I don't think I've got any more questions. I think we've literally covered everything. I think that's been really great. I mean, people can really take that, and there's loads of stuff, actionable tips they can take away. Now, if people want to get in touch with you, obviously you've got vividcovers.com. Is that the best place for them to get in touch with you, or do you have any social media?
Yeah, there's a form on the website. My work email is design@vividcovers.com. I'm pretty sure you can look me up on Facebook, but yeah, design@vividcovers.com is the most immediate direct line to me. And I am open to, if anybody has any questions about the process. I do really enjoy kind of the author education side of my job. I really, really enjoy it. I actually wrote a book a few years back. This was my 2020 project, and this is it. It's called Cover Your Book,
Yeah.
by R. Haskell. And it basically just takes you through the process of, where do you start? Where do you find a designer? How do you know they're the right one? How do you avoid anything scammy? How do you approach the designer? How do you communicate your vision effectively? If problems arise, how do you address those? I have some sample emails in here of how to tell a designer that the draft they sent you is no good. A lot of the authors that I've worked with and that I know are a little bit conflict averse, and they really struggle with that part of it about, how do I tell them that their art's bad? I don't want to hurt their feelings. Really clear communication between you and your service providers is really essential for you guys both being happy. And so I cover all of that. There's resources on how to get more information from other designers. There's a plea to please stop crowdsourcing your covers. on social media. Please stop doing this. Cover by committee is never the right choice. But anyway, so anybody who's completely new to this process and doesn't know where to start, that is, there's a lot of really good information in there. But on a personal level, if anybody just wants to email me, send me a DM, I'm more than happy to help.
Brilliant. Has anyone ever used your example emails to tell you they don't like your cover that you've designed?
I'm waiting for the day. I'm waiting for the day because that will just be a joy when it happens.
Yeah. You're going to get people doing that now when they do it. Well, thank you so.
Clients are always happy, of course.
Well, thank you so much, Rebekah. I've really enjoyed that.
I appreciate you having me on, Teddy.
Yeah, no worries. So just one last question before we go. What is the one book you recommend that everyone should be reading?
Okay, so I have two. I have two that I want to tell you about. The first is I've got to check the title here and make sure it's the right title. There we go. This was revolutionary for me as a business book, especially as someone who is a little ADHD, as a lot of us creatives are. I have noticed there's a lot of us in the writing and art space. It's this book called Never Check Email in the Morning by Julie Morgenstern. Especially as somebody who is self-employed, who my day goes the way that I dictate that it goes. And I know that a lot of authors resonate with that. This was revolutionary for me in just conceptualizing how to approach work when it was completely 100% underneath my control. So Never Check Email in the Morning. Loved that book. Was hugely helpful to me as a business owner and as a self-employed freelancer. So really recommend that. I also am a fantasy nut. I love reading fantasy. And John Bierce's Mage Errant series is the most recent thing that has just blown my mind. One of the most unique and rich and well thought out and very, very interesting settings that I have experienced. I feel like it's up there with Brandon Sanderson as far as the uniqueness of his setting. Really, really interesting characters and concepts. I think there's 7 books in the series. I read it all in 1 month, which is, for me, is quite a lot. It's quite a lot because I have 5 children and a job. So it really, really, really grabbed me. John Bierce, Mage Errant, just phenomenal. So
you've sold. I'm going to go and get it now. Well, thanks, Rebekah. It's been great chatting to you and looking forward to meeting you in person soon.
Appreciate it, Teddy. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Publishing Performance podcast. I really hope you found today's episode inspiring. I love chatting to authors, writers, and people in the publishing world. Now, just before we wrap up, let me tell you about Publishing Performance, the #1 platform for authors who want to increase Amazon book sales, but are not really sure where to start. Now, this show is all about helping you to sell more books. And if you're looking to boost your publishing game and to maximize your book's potential on Amazon, then Publishing Performance is designed to help authors just like you to grow your readership and to reach a much wider audience. Now, I know that Amazon ads can be slightly complicated, which is why Publishing Performance is like having a personalized ad account manager to create your ad campaigns, to choose your best keywords, and to make adjustments in real time. Now, if you're investing in ads, you really want to make sure that your investment is being used effectively, and Publishing Performance does just that. It aims to make your budget go further, improve your organic rank, and target keywords more effectively. Just go to publishingperformance.com to get started with Amazon ads for just $1.